listening to Themes and Memes, a different kind of movie review. I'm your host, Aaron Franz, and with me here is my co-host, Adam. How you doing there?
Yeah, not so bad, Aaron. It's good to talk to you again. Once again, we've been a while. It's been even busier and even crazier than normal, and so apologies to the audience. We're only just getting this episode out right at the very end of December. But
the end of the year.
The end of the year. Yeah, that's right.
This is it.
But yeah.
Yeah, no, we're doing good though, and I really feel as though this review is going to be a good one, and listeners are going to be very pleased with it. It's an older film; it's not current, but as I was just telling you, Adam, I feel this is one of the most important. I'm going to go on a limb and say one of the most important films of our generation, especially of our generation when we were a bit younger. You know, when this movie came out, this really appealed to us and was, I think, tailor-made for us. And what do you have to say about that? And I mentioned the movie because I didn't even mention it yet.
Yeah. Well, we are talking, for those of the members of the audience who are not telepathic, we're talking about the film The Doors. So, you know, the 1991 film, it's Oliver Stone directed that one. It's got Val Kilmer, Meg Ryan, a few other people in it. But yeah, it's about the story of The Doors of Jim Morrison.
It's a biopic.
Biopic, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a lot of it's a very interesting film on a number of different levels, and so I feel you in terms of what you're saying about it being a very, very significant and important film, especially for our generation. So why don't you lead off with that and tell the audience exactly what you're getting at there, because I'm sure that we can go back and forth on that.
Sure. Well, to begin with, the Doors as a band were a very important creation, and the whole story of the Doors is one that is really little known, and I think a glimpse into the full story, just a glimpse, not the whole thing, was given through the research of Dave McGowan in his book, Weird Scenes Inside the LC, that gets into Jim Morrison, The Doors, and many other bands that were working out of the Laurel Canyon area here in Los Angeles in the 60s and 70s. And just to be brief there, they've pointed out the fact that a lot of those bands had backgrounds in the sort of military intelligence sphere, where their parents were all military or intelligence backgrounds, and really weird stuff to do with that, and many other details there. So the Doors and all those other hippie type bands have a lot more going on than people realize. And when taking the backgrounds of the band members is one thing, but then when you really start analyzing the lyrics and the onstage antics, if you're talking about Jim Morrison especially, one has to wonder, like, okay, were these groups... We know the story that's been presented to us, that they're artists and they're just, they're kind of wacky bohemian types, and, artists do crazy things. But were these artists put up to certain behaviors? Were they doing certain things for some purpose? And if so, what was that purpose? What were they put up to these bizarre things that they did? You know what I mean?
Or perhaps one other way to look at it would be, were they cultivated in some way? So if it's not a direct, so not a case of them being directly put up to something in terms of, like being asked to do it and sort of it all being, planned or like intentionally orchestrated, or, it can be a scenario where, certain people in, these, from these backgrounds, like, you've got the military intelligence connection with so many of these people from the birth of the hippie era in Laurel Canyon. Were they perhaps a certain personality type that was recognized, picked up on by their, by their parents in these areas? Were they sort of groomed in some way? Were they tested? Were they given, were they introduced to people, given connections? Were doors open for them because of, I don't know, a certain predisposition or certain tendencies they might have given their background, given their upbringing, things like that. I mean, that's, I think that's a question that needs to be asked in this context. Because I mean, what is the other explanation when you've got so many of these sort of culturally significant people all kind of going in one direction, more or less,
living in one place,
and all having the same background? You know,
yeah.
You got to. I think like an element of possibly, certain personality types being cultivated over a long period of time to go and do something like this, perhaps.
Yeah.
And that certainly seems to have been something like that with the Doors and Jim Morrison.
Definitely, because, well, I don't know how much we want to get into this point. I think we'll hit this point as we go through the review, but just keep this in mind that, what's the deal with these musical culture creators of the 60s and 70s, and how much do we really know, and keep that in the context of this movie. But another thing I kind of wanted to mention before we even start out the review is the phenomenon of the biopic itself. And this movie, I believe I've seen 3 times. I've either seen it twice or 3 times. I want to say the first time I saw it, I was, a naive young kid like anybody else who first saw it. I was like, okay, that's cool. Jim Morrison, that was fun. The second time, I had started researching, alternative research type topics, occult and things like that, and it blew me away. I was like, whoa. And then the third time was the one I watched for this review. But the second time I specifically remember watching, and the fact that this movie was a biography of Jim Morrison really struck me, and I got really upset at the whole phenomenon of the biopic in general, in that these movies are a way to take somebody's life and portray it to a worldwide audience and say, here it is, here's the full life of this person, this is exactly... And they're not, the filmmakers aren't saying this, but in effect, this is what happens. The people who watch it go, oh, that was Jim Morrison's life, and it happened just like that.
Well, that's the inference, obviously, isn't it? Yeah.
What do you have to say about that effect,
Oh, yeah,
Adam?
well, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. The filmmakers will say, okay, we used artistic license here. We're not saying that this is exactly how this happened. I mean, there's a number of things that in that film, for example, when Jim Morrison is... has an argument with his girlfriend and he locks her inside a cupboard and then sets it on fire. Things like that. You think, God, that's really crazy and ugly. But I mean, that was contested. All the other band members said that never happened. And so there's these there are these little disputes, and the filmmakers will say, okay, not all of it is true, but obviously the intent is for the audience to believe that it's true.
Yeah, totally.
Otherwise, it's not going to be included in the biopic, is it?
Yeah.
It would be fiction otherwise, and would be presented as fiction. So obviously, the inference is that this is representing the events that did actually happen in someone's life fairly accurately.
Yeah.
And so it's obviously intentional.
Exactly. It just really annoys me, and from that point, I'm pretty sure that was a turning point in my life where I just started really having a distaste for the biopics. And they've done so many on different musical frontmen like Jim Morrison. They did one on Johnny Cash. They've done ones on other people, and just every time I feel that way, I'm like, oh man, I just don't like it. I don't like the fact that they make this movie about a person, and they can take artistic license, and then it's like they own that person. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, that's what it's like. It's like an individual's life is it's the sum total of so many different things, and then some. And there's so many gray areas. So many areas of moral ambiguity, of uncertainty, of different points of view. So many things are subjective, but yet when it's all crammed together into a film, you're just getting, almost a very, very rigid, sort of description, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
Or portrayal of what that is, and it's you can never do justice to an individual's life through one film, and so there's always going to be that, isn't there?
And the dark side is this: you can use a person's life, a person who's dead and can't speak for themselves, to push an agenda you may have for making the film. And of course, you and I talk about agendas in films, and I think if there's an agenda in this film, it's an incredibly complex one because it hits so many topics. So from here on out, I just want to talk about individual notes from the film that popped out to me, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
And we'll just talk about it. We have the occult aspect of this film, and in the beginning, Jim Morrison mentions the ceremony is about to begin. Basically just saying that this is an occult film, I would say. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, there's that monologue at the very beginning, and is that something that was taken from one of his like jam poetry sessions, or was it from his film school thing? Because it sounded like it, because he was talking about the what was it, someone being ushered into a theater,
Yeah, there you go.
Stage.
Yep.
There was the whole issue of the the stage and the theater, the show, the ritual, the event was all brought up in that monologue at the very beginning. And I think they close it off at the end with that too, or some other part of it. So yeah, that's, that's certainly in there. And that, I mean, we could go off in so many different tangents in terms of what that might mean.
Well,
certainly.
They're definitely referencing Dionysus a million times over in the film, and the occult significance of the theater and the stage, which have everything to do with Dionysus. So, I mean, that much we can clearly see.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, again, as you say, this is brought up so many times throughout the film. He makes references to Dionysus, and there's so many tie-ins in terms of his own philosophical or ideological beliefs and what you might call the Dionysian cult, perhaps, the sort of the cult of vice, of hedonism, of ritual, of
god of the vine, getting drunk,
the vine, the grape, the
drunken revelry,
all that stuff, so like this is again brought out so many times this this name drop throughout the film, and it's obviously reflected in Jim Morrison's kind of demeanor and philosophy.
So you've got the god of drunken revelry, which Jim Morrison is here embodying that archetype. And then you've got, in pretty much every scene, he's got like a fifth of Bushmills in his hand. You know what I mean? So they're playing up that whole drunkenness aspect of Dionysus. Absolutely.
Oh yeah, and the sexual aspect of Dionysus as well, in terms of like the womanizing of Jim Morrison, the promiscuity, the being like I mean, like there's a number of different quotes throughout the film where these crazy female fans are just falling over themselves to get near him and stuff like that, and they're calling him like the god of rock and the god of cock as well. It's like there's like worshipping him as like a sex god as well, and
they're portrayed as maenads or bacchantes, the followers, the mad women followers of Dionysus that are naked and they run in a mania through the woods, or what the bacchantes were, and they were literally shown here at the concerts were the equivalent of those.
Yeah, you got it, man. That's it. That's exactly it, for sure.
Yeah. And of course, Jim Morrison, as the official bio goes outside of this film as well, he's said to be a shaman and an occultist, and this occult genius shaman man who came to enlighten a generation, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is another big sort of a theme which runs throughout the film, is the portrayal of Jim Morrison as some kind of solar god. I mean, from his physical appearance, in terms of he's got this kind of the long hair, and he grows the beard towards the end of his career in a live film, etc. And there's a lot of photos. I mean, the most famous photo that we see of Jim Morrison is that one where he's standing shirtless with his arms in a crucifix position.
Yes.
Yes. So, the black and white one, and there's so many other bits of artwork and art direction within the film, and also within the sort of the history of the Doors in general, which is it nods to some kind of some kind of like solar Sun King archetype, or a Jesus type archetype, something like that.
Yep.
And so, you've got that, coupled with the fact that he sees himself as a shaman. And throughout the film, there are a number of quotes where he's talking about that. He's talking about his interest in Native American traditions, psychedelics, things like that. So he's sort of like almost like a New Age Jesus or something.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah. The Native American thing. He's a shaman. And they pull in the whole drug use of hallucinogens. They pull that into the mix. They mention acid again, maybe one or two more times than they mention the word Dionysus, the name Dionysus. I can't tell which one they mentioned more, acid or Dionysus.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy. There's a number of scenes, and there's like the Doors, the lyrics are kind of riddled with this kind of stuff as well. That sort of blending like the occult tradition with sort of a slightly more modern take on I don't know, like like hallucinogenics and religion, spirituality, things like that.
Yes, and making the naive audience. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to talk down everybody who likes the Doors, but you know what I mean. Like, they're hoping that the audience is naive and that they will equate the use of these drugs to
enlightenment of some sort.
Yeah. And they equate it to like shamans of Native American cultures, and they want you to think that's what the shamans were doing. Like, the shamans would have done this, man. And look, Jim Morrison was up there dancing with the Indians on stage, and he's one of them.
Yeah, this is the trick that is used with so many of these, I suppose, countercultural rock bands, and it's been going on since the 1960s, where the use of things like hallucinogenic drugs and other types of drugs is equated with some kind of spiritual enlightenment. It's equated with sort of some kind of moral, spiritual, philosophical superiority of some sort, and they're always lumped in together as, like you say, he's.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just saying there's a definite push to use drugs throughout these things. I mean, you can barely even dispute that. I'm sure somebody probably would, but I don't know. I don't know why.
I don't know where that'd be coming from.
I don't know how you do that, but
it's very, very, very prominent throughout this film, and again, it's pretty much all of these countercultural bands that were culture creators in one form or another at some point or another. There's usually some. The drugs are always thrown into the mix at some point. The lead singer's got some kind of addiction, or he's got some philosophical attachment to drugs, usually things like hallucinogens, like psilocybin, LSD, all this kind of stuff. And it's always equated with them having some kind of enlightened, superior knowledge or ability of some sort.
That's a theme that's run through rock and roll. Like you said, I'd say since about the time of Jim Morrison. He was one of the ones that really kicked this off.
He was kind of the first ones,
Yeah. But, you've got lots of 90s bands. A lot of the frontmen were, like, on heroin and stuff, and a lot of guys ended up dying. And it's always, they're portrayed as, like, this beautiful artist who is misunderstood. And the fact...
Tortured artist.
Yeah, tortured artist, that sort of archetype. And the fact that they used, like, heroin or whatever is actually glorified, all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was... like Kurt Cobain, classic example. I mean, he was a heroin addict for a number of years until he, committed suicide, both by taking an overdose of heroin and apparently shooting himself. There's some intrigue there, but that's for all accounts what happened. But I remember there was so much focus put on his drug use when Nirvana, I think more so after, he killed himself or he died, and there was always this kind of, again, like Jim Morrison, like so many of these other people, there's always a rationalization and a justification for that. I mean, I think with the more spiritually geared, shall we say, artists and bands, it's tied into things like religion or occultism or some kind of spiritual message, some kind of higher enlightened spiritual ideology, whereas with I think more recent bands, say like 1990s for example, it was like, oh well, they just, like the story with Kurt Cobain was, well, he had this awful stomach problem, like some kind of illness, and he was only taking heroin because he was in so much pain all the time. And that may have been true in part, but it's this agenda to say, well, actually, it's not so cut and dry. Drug use is actually it can be legitimized, it can be justified. These people
and look,
are really fantastic.
all these heroes you look up to do it. So exactly. What does that say?
Well, I mean, this is what we've been getting consistently since about the time of the Doors. Is the lead frontman, the culture creator, the martyr, the savior, whatever, is always doing something like this, and in turn is essentially promoting it to the entirety of the audience.
And beyond that. No matter what the case is for the particular musician, we get after the fact, now they're dead. Now there's a biopic made of them, and that's where the drug use really gets glorified. And certainly,
they can mythologize it.
The drug use and the drinking in this movie was absolutely a glorification of those things. And if you don't think I mean, it clearly was.
Absolutely, of course it was. I mean, he's throughout the film, Morrison is just slowly but surely drinking more and more and more. He's inebriated more and more of the time.
Yeah.
He's alienating his friends. He's destroying his career bit by bit. But I mean, that ends up working in his favor because it's so radical and shocking that everyone wants a piece of it. But
Yeah.
regardless, he's destroying his relationship. His girlfriend's having like a nervous breakdown every other minute. And,
Yeah.
but it's all so magnificent, because at the time it was so countercultural, it was so radical, it was so different, it was going against the grain. It's equated with some kind of
success
success.
Yeah, because certainly the Doors was a successful band, but I'm sure we'll probably return to this overall theme of bad influence on the youngins. But for now, I just want to point out some weird stuff I noticed because there's so many little things in this. But one was near the beginning of the film where young Jim Morrison is living in Venice Beach and he meets his long-term girlfriend that's there throughout the film, the Meg Ryan character. He climbs up like on a balcony to see her at a party, and this is a weird line. Tell me what you think of this, Adam, because anyway, here. He climbs up on a balcony and Meg Ryan asks, "You got a problem with doors?" And then Jim Morrison says, "They're a waste of time." And this popped out to me. I'm like, are they talking about the band at the Doors? Is that some sort of like little thing, or is that just some sort of?
Well, I think there's probably like an element of the metaphorical reference going on there, because obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I mean, this is brought up in the film, and we talk about this plenty in our discussions, is that the Doors, the name The Doors came from Aldous Huxley's book Doors of Perception.
Oh yeah.
And when he was talking about his own experiments with LSD and the doors that opens up in the mind, etc.
Yep.
And so, I think that may have been what he might have been referring to, or at least what the filmmakers might have intended it to be taken as. Jim Morrison sees any kind of barrier in the mind as a waste of time. Everything's got to be open, and that's where he's coming from. So I don't know.
I might have been reaching. I just felt like maybe they were saying like the Doors as a band is a waste of time. And this film says the opposite, but in this little line, I don't know. I'm reaching on that one. I'm sorry.
But, no, you may be well onto something. I mean, maybe if I thought about it more, I might agree with you. But I do remember that one. I suppose maybe it just didn't stand out to me quite as much.
Okay, let's talk about the part where, this is the formative time of the band The Doors. Before they're a band, you've got the scene where Morrison and Manzarek are on the beach. And, like, hey, what are you doing? What are you up to, Jim? How you been? Can you sing? And Jim Morrison's like, I don't know, maybe. And then he's reading off this poetry to Manzarek. And they start singing. Manzarek's like, whoa, man, we need to make a band. And then the things that Manzarek, played by Kyle MacLachlan, the things he says is really crazy. He starts saying things like, the planet is screaming for change.
Yes.
We got to make the myths.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that.
What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, hey, do I need to spell it out?
Yes.
I mean, all right then. Okay, so he's talking about, I mean, this is 1960s, right? So we're talking about an era. This is like 1965. I'm pretty sure this conversation is supposed to have happened in the film. But anyway, so, a time of great social change, socio-political change, huge radical cultural change was beginning to form, and they're obviously picking up on this, and they're picking up on all the change, and basically saying that in order to perpetuate this change, in order to be a part of this change, in order to direct this change in the way that we see fit, we need to be the ones creating the culture going forward in terms of making the myths.
Making the myths. Yeah.
Making the myths, and this is, I mean, how relevant is that to what we're talking about here? Myth-making, biopics,
Yep. Yeah, and again, the actual history and the real deep bios of these musicians, who they actually are, going back to Dave McGowan's research, that plays in here, because are these guys, part of a military-industrial scheme of some sort, whether consciously or unconsciously? And if so, that would be sort of the military having a hand in making these myths. And again, we come back to the same old point. So we're just making that point again, which is worthy to do. But also in that same, Zarek is just rifling stuff off there. He mentions Dionysus again. He mentions William Blake, the famous alchemist, and he's just rifling off this stuff. I couldn't write down my notes, all the stuff he was saying. It's like, geez, this is crazy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember that, and I remember just watching that, going, "Whoa,
hold up,
yeah, hold up there, yeah." It's it's that particular, I think, scene where, well, a bit of dialogue where they're talking about the doors of perception. So they're talking about Automatically, the book, and they're talking about the fact that actually that line, that particular sort of tagline or term, was actually taken by Aldous Huxley from William Blake. You know, the
yes,
alchemist,
mystic,
from earlier
alchemist,
on, you know?
yes,
yeah. So, you know, again, these are things that pop up in so many of the other discussions we have, and here it is in this film again. So, you know, it's I don't think in this film they spend an awful lot of time spelling out the particular significance of the occult aspects of the film and the things that Morrison was into. I mean, it seemed a little bit more like name dropping to me. I mean, maybe that's unfair. I'm not sure how much detail they really could have gone to and all.
They do it in some cartoonish fashions, which we may get into later too, but they could have done it less cartoony.
I think that's probably what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
I think, maybe that's a better way of describing it, actually, because we see, or we hear, you know, constant references to, you know, Dionysus, you know, and then there's the blood ritual that he participates his witch girlfriend,
yes, that's
you know,
right.
later on, and that a lot of, again, you know, they're really bringing out the point that you know, he was really into.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But they're not really doing a hell of a lot to explain, like, exactly how his philosophies, his own personality type fitted into all that and what it really meant. It was just kind of, this is how it was.
yeah. But they only have a short space, even in this long film, and you can't pay justice to those sorts of intricacies.
No.
So what you do is you just flat out put a witch, which the audience is going to recognize as an occultist, and we go, okay, we put this witch character in there. We have her, you know, philander with Jim Morrison, and have them take part in the most blatant of occult rituals where they're like bleeding and all this.
Yeah.
You know, they're sharing each other's blood and all this. They're jumping around with a horn attached to their head. We're like, okay, this is an occult thing they're doing.
Yeah.
And therefore the audience goes, okay, Jim Morrison was into the occult. I understand that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I see they've got to do the most obvious, most extreme cartoon version of what it is they're trying to get across to get people to actually recognize it as being what it is.
I think so. I think there's a bit of that going on.
Yeah,
there's more to it than that as well. But I definitely think that is going on. There's so many like little lines and just little details in this movie that just I noticed. One was, okay, they're at the Whiskey A Go Go where they start getting famous, right, on the Sunset Strip, and they're walking up to the whiskey and they're talking, Jim Morrison and the other band members, and they go, let's plan a murder or start a religion. And then they mention transcendental meditation in the same line.
Oh, that's the other thing. Yeah. Sorry, just while you mentioned it, they mentioned TMs like a good 3 or 4 times in this. You're like, was it Manzarek or was it Morrison? Was somebody in the band? I can't remember who it was, but they were like, Morrison was saying, oh, you've got to try acid or you've got to take this or whatever it is. And he's like, no, man, I don't do that stuff. I'm into TM. You know?
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of funny, but anyway, sorry, go on.
Well, they're just mentioning all the cult activity happening in that area. You know what I mean? So much. You'd have to talk forever and ever about all the cults that were into this stuff in the Hollywood Hills area there. And that's what they're saying. They're saying, let's start a religion, you know, like all these cults are doing. Let's plan a murder, like Charlie Manson. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So they're just referencing all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, what year were the Manson murders again? Was that 1968? Was it 69?
I don't know exactly. Right around that time.
Yeah, so this probably would have been a few years beforehand. So that's kind of interesting that, you know, they're talking about planning a murder, you know, before the Manson murders actually happened. But, you know, there was the Tate murder as well, and there's quite a few in that Laurel Canyon area, weren't there? Yeah.
And certainly the filmmakers are just, you know, pointing this out and referencing all this and connecting all this stuff because, you know, all the same, it's in the same area, same geographic location there. And they're just referencing the fact that, hey, the Doors were in the midst of this, so let's have the characters say this sort of thing. So at the very least, it's that. But I think there's a bit more going on there than that as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, you've got to ask, like, where was Oliver Stone coming from with this? Because he's somebody who's, he did the JFK film, which is an extremely long, detailed, and I think quite insightful film. I mean, I'm not saying that the theory put forth in that film was necessarily true, but it's smart,
Yeah.
Well,
it's worthwhile to say he's the guy that was picked to make the movie about the premier American conspiracy theory of all time.
Yeah. That's kind of what I'm getting at here. Yeah. And I think that what I was going to say is that it interests me that he was also perhaps the guy that was picked to do the biopic on the Doors. The premier, American countercultural rock band that started so much, and like in the mid-1960s, before a lot of other bands had really picked up steam.
And on the surface, there's no conspiracy there whatsoever. But then again, when you get into the research of McGowan and all that sort of stuff, well, we're smack dab in the center of conspiracy town. You know what I mean? Like it can be any deeper.
And so I guess where's Oliver Stone coming from with this film? Is he talking? I mean, he's obviously knows enough about what he's talking about to make mention of the fact that Jim Morrison's father was high Navy admiral who was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. That all this stuff was going on in the Laurel Canyon area with people creating religions, creating myths. There was all the drug taking, the murders, all this stuff. So he's picked up on all that.
Yeah, and it should be mentioned that Jim Morrison's father, being the admiral during the Gulf of Tonkin, was actually mentioned overtly in this film, and that I did not remember until I watched it again this time. I didn't realize they actually said that.
Well, they did, because what happened was when Jim Morrison meets this witch girlfriend of his, she's like a reporter or something like that.
Yeah, reporter.
And he tells her, she asks something about his parents, and he said like, "Oh, my parents are dead," and that puts her off asking him more questions. But they get together, and so she decides to do some digging because she suspects he's lying or whatever, and she finds out that his parents are not dead at all. And at that point in the film, when she confronts him about it, it's brought out that his dad was.
She's the one who tells
George
me, like,
Morrison.
I looked you up, man. She's trying to call him out, like, your dad was the admiral in the Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah.
And that blew me away that they put that in the film, because that's a fact that doesn't get mentioned too often in the biography of Jim Morrison. It's something that lends, I guess you could say, more of an air of credibility to this particular biopic, because that's a detail, again, that gets ignored usually. So,
well, yeah. I mean, the only two places, I mean, I've not read like the biography myself, but the only two places I've heard that fact mentioned are Dave McGowan's research and this film,
Yeah.
So it's interesting, obviously Dave McGowan is looking at this thing from I suppose, what you might call a conspiratorial angle. And perhaps it could be argued that although it wasn't necessarily really pushed in the Oliver Stone film, perhaps maybe he was toying with a few of those elements.
Yeah. Could be.
I don't know.
Could be. Now, I want to jump to the part in the film where the band goes out to the desert to take peyote together to, get this sort of inspiration, this inspirational drug-taking experience.
To break on through to the other side, as it were.
Exactly. And certainly Jim Morrison's shown as like this healer sort of character.
Yeah.
He's trying to heal all the band's like subconscious frustrations.
That is very interesting that you bring that up, actually, because it just got me thinking. I do remember that when they go out into the desert, they take the peyote and they're all tripping out, and Jim is like chilled and he's really enjoying himself. But there's like another couple of the band members are not. They're kind of freaking out because it's very intense, and they're like getting all self-analytical about all of their problems and feeling overwhelmed and all this stuff. And Jim comes in and he's like, share your pain, man, and let it go, and it's okay. And he's giving them all this kind of, really emotionally rich, like moral support, and it really, really does present him as some kind of, like a healer.
He's the healer. He's the shaman. And again, taking these drugs as a way to like advance oneself and all of that. And also, there's a bizarre connection to another movie here. I can't wait to see what you make of this, Adam. But Wayne's World 2, the silly comedy movie, parodies this film. And it's got Jim Morrison out in the desert, and Wayne is there, and he's like, hey, look, a naked Indian. And there's actually a part in Wayne's World 2 where the Jim Morrison character out in the desert is talking to Sammy Davis Jr., and they're talking about the military-industrial complex, and that's Wayne's World 2. And that's just a weird sort of, like, when I watched that, and I'm really getting out there now, but that just struck me as weird. I'm like, why did they choose to have Jim Morrison and Sammy Davis Jr. in this weird comedy movie talk about the military-industrial complex?
Yeah, I have not seen Wayne's World 2 in so long.
Yeah.
So I cannot remember that particular scene, but that is interesting that would just be dumped in there.
Yeah.
Just slotted into a silly comedy film like that.
Yeah.
That is.
And it's a parody of this film.
Yeah.
So was Mike Myers making some sort of social commentary? And I don't know what was going on. It's weird.
Well, Mike Myers is into his transcendental meditation and his shamanism to a degree. I know that much.
There you go.
So I don't know what that means, but
well, I don't know why I felt the need to put that in there. I just did. So let's get back on topic with this actual movie, and let's see. Yeah, so there's a scene where they're showing the Haight-Ashbury scene in San Francisco, and that's shown as the pinnacle of the hippie dream. Everybody's partying and all that. I don't know. What do you think about the hippiness being portrayed here?
Yeah, I'm just trying to. There's so much of it because so much of the film is basically like concerts. It's performances and it's crazy crowds on drugs. And Jim Morrison, all over the place. But yeah, there is. I think one of the things that was brought out a lot in the, when it's showing the Doors playing and Jim Morrison drunk on stage doing all this crazy stuff is that. They were spearheading something really radical because there's quite a lot of scenes, a number of them in the film where he basically gets really really drunk on stage and ends up like going way off script and doing something really really outrageous and obscene and really upsetting the audience. Like he tries to start a riot at one point, he starts insulting like the audience, he gets arrested on stage by saying something really rude, like lewd and horrible, and it's but at the same time, although like you've got slightly more conservative people rejecting this and being offended by this, they also show you how so many people in the music industry were absolutely enamored with all of this and thought like because it was so radical, because it was so offensive that this was gonna be the new thing, this was the future, and they wanted a piece of it. Yeah. So I think that really stood out to me in terms of like the progression through the film where they're doing more and more concerts and it gets into like the late 60s with the whole hippie thing going on. Yeah. There was like there's the fact that this is brought out in the film that they were actually not invited to Woodstock when pretty much everybody else of that era and that area was. But they were not because they had acted so. They were naughty. Yeah, they acted. You know what I mean? So it's like that's almost like cultural kind of martyrdom in itself because it's like Woodstock was supposed to be the epitome, the pinnacle of countercultural trends at that time.
They were so bad.
They were so bad. They didn't even. So countercultural, so radical that even Woodstock was, that was too tame for them, and they weren't allowed to go.
Yeah, and one has to wonder. I really wonder if, because these acts that Jim Morrison did on stage, like exposing himself and all this, these things actually happened. I'm just wondering if Morrison, again, was put up to it, or if he was encouraged in more subtle ways, like, hey, you ought to do these crazy things. And who might have been the influencers telling him to do that? You know what what I mean?
Yeah. Well, here we come back to what we talked about at the very beginning, don't we?
Yes.
Was this because when you talk about these types of concepts, it's less plausible, I think, and I think you'd probably agree that people were being, that this many people in this scene at the same time were all being put up to this and were all doing these things consciously at the instruction of somebody behind the scenes.
Yeah.
However, that is not to say that these people were not, let's say, maneuvered, guided, influenced, coerced, pushed gently into doing some of these things. They may have had handlers, they may have had band members that were perhaps in cahoots with some kind of elitist groups or organizations or with the military industrial complex, whatever it is. But or they may have had people in the music. I mean, most likely, I would say people from record labels, people in the culture and music industry, looking at what was happening, thinking we can really create a wave here and ride this thing for a while. So let's get these guys, let's keep them drinking, let's keep them on drugs. We'll encourage all this stuff. We'll make it popular. We'll promote it, and we'll just, keep nurturing this thing and push it in a direction so that it begins to fuel itself. So we push things in a certain direction to the point that it's got its own momentum, and it's just going to keep getting crazier because that's what's going to happen. It's the only way it can go, and we can again turn this into something really monumental and some big cultural phenomenon that we can all profit off, and we can all, of course, drive culture in a certain direction. So.
Yeah, because again, you've got the audience made up of young people who are idolizing the god Dionysus on stage, like worshiping that god, and they're given behavior to emulate, even, and self-destructive behavior. And that's the thread that runs throughout this film. Of if Jim Morrison is the role model, then he's one that's promoting self-destruction. Is the simple way to put it. Yeah.
Simply, that's what it is. Yeah. And this is again what we were talking about before. It's not just Jim Morrison here. I think he was probably the first person that this aura was put around, and it was promoted to this level. I mean, you could somewhat. You may be able to say something similar to Elvis Presley, who Jim Morrison actually idolized, funnily enough. But it's they give you this role model, they give you this cultural icon, this pundit, and he acts in self-destructive ways. And because he's a role model, you think, well, it's good to act in self-destructive ways then, because he's doing it. And that's simply what it is. And this is what's been happening ever since then.
Taking that to modern day or whatever, you had him acting as a role model at the time in the 60s for the young people then, and then you have time elapsing. Typically as time goes by, people forget about stuff, but they don't forget about it when a movie is made to remind you about the band. And, the movie brings back Jim Morrison and the Doors as these figures we need to remember. And then all of a sudden, this new generation, our generation, is listening to the Doors, is saying that Jim Morrison is a shaman and wanting to do drugs like he did, and just listening to the music, if nothing else. And, it makes it cool again.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And it reminds me of what you said earlier on at the very beginning about how this film you felt was arguably one of the most important films of our time in terms of cultural significance and the kind of narratives and ideas that are being put forth there. And what it reminds me of is the fact that when I was let's say like early teens, that age, I was into listening to a lot of alternative rock and stuff, and I wasn't really into some of the, I suppose, what you might call hippie rock or classic rock or whatever. Yeah, from like the 1960s and 70s, like the Doors, like Rolling Stones or whatever. But I did see so many other people around me were into this stuff, people the same age as me that absolutely loved the stuff, and the Doors was probably the biggest. So when I was growing up in the, let's say like mid-teens, mid-late 90s, this stuff, like the Doors were immensely popular with my peer group, with those around me of the same age. I wasn't really into them, but everybody else absolutely loved the Doors, and they absolutely worshiped Jim Morrison. Yeah. And so I, for a band that has, was only around for a few years, and, there was basically, with the lead guy dying, like a whole couple of generations ago, you've got to wonder, and it would make sense that the interest that I saw growing up was reinvigorated by that film, which was 1991, So it's like a whole new generation, 1991 onwards, being reintroduced to the Doors, to Jim Morrison, and having that obsession reignited, I suppose. Yeah,
definitely. I know people my age that loved the film, and I would argue to say that the film had the effect that it made the Doors cool again. And of course you get all the VH1 shows that brought back these bands like this, and like Remembering the Music and so
Remembering the Music,
whatever those shows are, that adds into that whole effect. But if you're thinking in terms of these bands being put out there into the mainstream in the 60s when they were new, for a purpose, to sow these different sort of cultural memes to get people to like emulate these sort of behaviors or whatever, to put out definite ideas, then it would make sense to bring it back later if it's really an important thing you want to keep going. You got to keep reminding people.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, obviously it's a few generations down the line if we talk about, like late 1960s to late 1990s. But again, if the themes themselves, if the ideas themselves still are relevant, if they can still apply to that era, then you're not going to throw away something if it works, are you? So it would make sense that would be reinvigorated, because the basic emphasis, I would say, on existentialism, hedonism, nihilism, all the stuff surrounding like the kind of cult of Dionysus is still completely relevant to this generation and generations of the past couple of decades. So, it was, they could probably use it all over again, in another 10, 15 years. They can make, if they wanted to, if they hadn't done so already, they could probably do another Doors biopic and bring all that stuff out again. It would still be, just as relevant, or just as useful to that end, if you will.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they did either, the way they keep repeating movies these days.
Yeah,
like remaking movies and all that. It's ridiculous.
I know.
But yeah, I got to say that would be the main point of this movie, but I just want to keep going on bringing up different sort of details I noticed in this film, because there's so many things that interested me. One was, let's see here. Well, there's this part where he's having his photo taken, Jim Morrison, the famous black and white photos that a lot of people recognize. The Best of the Doors album has these photos, or has one of them on the cover. And so he's doing these photos, and the photographer's like telling him that he's really great, and there's no rules and all this, and she says that you're a god of rock, she tells him. And he takes this picture, and then Jim Morrison goes in this kind of trance thing where it shows his face, and then it shows a bust of, I don't know who, it might be like Plato or some sort of Greek philosopher or something, but it juxtaposes the bust of him alive with this like sculpted bust of something from the ancient world. And, if he's a god of rock, a sculpture kind of is like a carved rock, right? So it's a literal rock being showed. But it's also showing like his immortality, and this whole process is giving him immortality and all that. And I don't know. What do you have to think about that?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure I remember what you're talking about there. So I think if I was to, assign any significance to that, it would be on the whole issue of like, immortalizing Jim Morrison. And so she's saying, you're a god of rock, and she's immortalizing him. And then they're showing you a clip of some other individual, like whoever it was, Plato or someone from like Greco-Roman period of history, that was also immortalized in that way. He was also remembered, who was turned into a statue, who everybody knows and everybody talks about, and who was considered as being, so relevant, so important and influential in whatever area, So I think that's probably, I think that's probably what they're getting at there.
Yeah. And again, it's just pointing to the process. Is like, hey, look, in making this movie, we're solidifying Jim Morrison's immortal status. We're trying to make that a reality. We're trying to make him into a god. We're telling you he's Dionysus, a literal god, right? We're keeping the memory of him alive. We're doing our best here, and we're going to literally tell you this thing while we're at it too.
Yeah. I mean, that's what it's at. I mean, there's so many different, like, I guess, layers and angles in this whole thing, in terms of really immortalizing, mythologizing the whole issue, his whole life and who he was, and equating him to some kind of, I said again, like some kind of, I really get the sun god thing, like the solar king, so much of the artwork, so many of the little references in the lyrics, things like that. So you've got the martyr, the savior, the shaman, the healer, the sun god. It's just, like every single mythological, religious kind of archetype of that nature is hit on and related to him in some way throughout this.
Yeah. There's one more line that he mentioned while he was on stage, I think towards the end of the movie. He's wearing a shirt that says 66, which is significant. Apparently the number of the great work, I think, in Freemasonry is 66. But anyway, he's saying on stage, "I'm a fake hero." So again, that's another line thrown in there that I just wonder about. Are the filmmakers like telling you this thing like,
Yeah.
he wasn't really, you're not being told the whole story, we're telling the story, but Jim Morrison isn't real as he's being presented even here. There's more to it maybe.
I think so. I think that could be, possibly, an angle to that in terms of, as you say, the filmmakers, like I say, we're going to present this myth to you, but we're also going to drop a little hint that it is just a myth. But there's also the possibility that, and I'll tell you what it reminds me of. It reminds me again of Kurt Cobain and the fact that the more popular Nirvana became, the more Cobain started to hate himself and began to refer to himself and think of himself as being a fraud. He started to really, believe that all this was all hype, that the whole of the band's success was created by the media machine, and he wanted to have, he loved doing what he did, but he wanted nothing to do with that whole like culture industry machine. And
he might have seen his biopic coming up before the fact. They didn't want somebody to own him after he died.
Yeah, I mean, hey, that's possible, but I think that's what I think of, and like with a quote like that, because it's I think it just plays right into the whole idea of the tortured artist who is very talented, who loves what they do, but also has this deep sense of conflict and a real love-hate thing going on with themselves, with their relationship to the industry, with their relationship to the system, to money, all of these other issues that they feel conflicted and kind of angry about. So I think I think that's may have been what they were trying to get at there, at least in part anyway, that there was a conflict within Jim Morrison, because he was a pretty unstable character from all accounts, and this is definitely portrayed in the film with the alcoholism and all the drugs. He was just in a bit of conflict. That's for sure.
One has to wonder the full ramifications. Of course, we're not going to know that. I would suggest don't go on the simple fact of this movie and what it's telling you. There's probably a whole lot more to it. And if you do that, then you're in good shape, I would say. So I think we should just end the review here, if that's all right with you, Adam. Did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Nothing particular. I just think it's probably just important just to drive home the basic points again, that this was a very influential film about a very influential person. This seems to have had a real impact on our generation, perhaps generations before and after us as well, and that this was done through a whole bunch of different angles to do with religious archetypes, to do with relating that to drug use, philosophy, morality, ideology, and I think combined together, I agree with you in saying that it's arguably like one of the most powerful and influential sort of narratives that's been put forth about this kind of thing, and now of our time.
I really do think that, and I think that it doesn't get recognized as such, and for that reason, I'm glad that we reviewed this, but. I'll just say to the audience, if you like the podcast, make sure you subscribe. tmpodcast.com is the website. I just wrote a new article if you want to check out the article I wrote on agenda-driven filmmaking, a concept we've talked about here a few times. And, anything else you have to say before we go here, Adam?
Not much. Good to talk to you again, Aaron. I think we promised to do another, like a double review this month, where we're going to do like a year in review, look at all the films of 2015 that we reviewed. We may not have time for that this month, but I think we still want to do that. We may start next year with that. So, I think that's still going to be in the pipes, yeah? Yeah,
well, perhaps. And if not, there'll be another movie review. There's going to be something good one way or the other. I know that.
Few delays recently, but I think we're going to try and get back a little bit more on track in the coming future. So, stay tuned, and thanks for listening.
Today's episode of Themes and Memes was recorded on the 29th of December, 2015.